Hello everyone, today we talk about 10th century European kingdoms. A general overview on this era that corresponds mostly to what we call the post-Carolingian one. I also created a playlist on the topic. You know that I've always been around there, even though I don't specialize in this century. But I think it's a crucial moment in the definition of most of what we can still appreciate today in a broader political, cultural, and identitary sense, beyond what, of course, is being carved from this history, as we will see now, and misused in some ways, mostly, in fact, in times that ideologically would have horrified people living and ruling in the 10th century, and that for some reason instead from the 19th, that reason that we know, of course, started being seen as the major interpretation, which most people as fourth estates, in fact those who previously were under, paradoxical belief, right? You find this incredibly jarring signing of contemporary identities that are the complete denial of any value, especially of the people who made those countries that people think that fundamentally they are part of, right? And trying to think, I'm like the king, I'm like the spirit, and basically siding with them, and never mind what they actually mean. Never mind that they're, again, the diametrically opposite meaning that those people actually believed, and that would have probably exterminated us if they had seen what we had actually become. Specifically because of that choice, not because of some other choice or some further weakening of the system. And it's, in my opinion, also a completely underappreciated century, right? I ever hardly see let's see what happened in the 10th century. In general, even centuries, of course, are not pretty much considered per se, didactically speaking, but the 10th normally is more like the Viking era and or basically it. Right, whenever one has to look at the continental or Central European dimension, the post-Carolingian reality, it's always complicated to even actually make people waking up and saying, look, that there was a lot going on there, and a very few catch these references. Of course, I don't extremize. Like, things are even much worse than how I described them. Naturally, it's more likely that my audience is going to be closer, in fact, to those. To this awareness than others. But I think it's important also to speak out loud about these things, because at the end of the day, that's the only reason why we make history, right? There is no other particular reason to research. And to reconstruct, to sort out the past, if we can't properly fix what from there we have basically misunderstood. So I have been creating, by the way, some century dedicated playlists, right? I think I haven't arrived to the 10th, but say most of the similar content, because I'm thinking what in which box you would mostly find it if you're interested, is the post-Carolingian Europe, right? And there's something partially in the Renovatio Imperii one, also in part in Latin Germanic Europe, that, as we will see today, also we mostly concentrate on. But not only, though, because again, the Central European dimension is interesting. There is also, the Slavs, the Magyars, etc. So, as you know, in 888, what Regino of Prüm, the German Benedictine of this time, defines the old Carolingian realms had created kings out of their own guts, literally. And this picture is quite vivid because there was some classical echo there, for example, as Scandinavia as the vagina of peoples and such things, and the fact that the Carolingian Empire here becomes essentially this kinglet's producer, right? And of course, king, let's compare to the broader imperial power, that at some point will not will be discontinuous, right? Or at least will be claimed by different leaders, and just the political territorial evidence was telling that the system had dramatically fragmented. It's still significant because it does remember some older, say, traditional myths, tales about these great dragons having a double meaning, right, in their power and their wisdom, but also in their danger. The dragon you have to slay within yourself in order to achieve something. That, however, can also involve, right, if you don't make it, can devour you, and that at some point breaks apart. And lots of other from the dragon's teeth. We've seen it. It's possibly the legend behind the Dauphin, actually, and all these various little sea monsters that would be knights fundamentally. And so highlighting also the tectonic dimension of the lesser elements of the hierarchy, that here are parallel to kings, as a matter of fact, as Regina wants to highlight how, the negative, let's say, mechanism that was involved. Right? So not a major overlord in the wake of the full imperial universal tradition, but lots of different kings that had now the control of what was previously a unitary system, and also in historical perspective, a Carolingian empire that had emerged in the West fundamentally after the Roman Empire is the largest power in the region since ever, that had crumbled yet again. So it's actually a dramatic century. As we perfectly know, historiographically, the 10th is the Iron Century. It's the one of the so-called second invasions of the Vikings, of the Magyars, of the Saracens. But, as I was saying before, what is striking of this century is exactly the capacity from the degree of fragmentation that we will see was at the peak towards the 20s, especially the 10th century, brought to the consolidation of important powers that more or less are the ones that you still see existing during the Middle Ages at large, and that in great part are still essentially the ancestors of the major European countries today. In the mid-9th century, the Carolingian Empire itself had already witnessed this first fragmentation, right? 888 is the death of Charles III. We made a video about him in connection with Rome and this constant need to reaffirm, in fact, the universality of the empire through the papacy and so on. And thus, already at this time, there had been, of course, an awareness of the crisis that such fragmentation represented. There had been a three-way division, right, essentially with the East and West Frankish kings competing for an increasingly fragmented middle kingdom that would be essentially Lotharingia, and the Italic kingdom that initially in the partition were together. Speaking of Western Francia and Eastern Francia, we of course cannot avoid to observe that this political and territorial dominations somehow overlap, roughly, approximately, with today, but still largely with today's France and Germany. And aside from the Italic kingdom, that at least for 2/3 does overlap with today's Italy, and other polities we will see now that were such as Burgundy that would eventually literally be erased as polities, and that up to this point even actually had a shot for some reason. I made multiple videos last year about the Kingdom of Burgundy, has been debated more, right? Because the role of France and Germany, especially in the aforementioned 19th century with the German unification, but also because, of course, of the imperial dignity. It was somehow monopolized by Germany, in spite of the fact that at some point the national monarchy crumbled, and it was France to be actually the most unitary country in Europe, also the greatest power from the 13th century, has always attracted this kind of dichotomic attention, right? Even today, today I would say France is in this broader pop culture. Not that I speak out of objective measure, but it is of course overlooked. Is kind of not like that. Nobody really cares. Like the Germans became the embodiment of some kind of ideal that fundamentally not even Germany has ever been, but it's consumed like this. Especially this is maybe a transatlantic issue that has to do with World War II, with the complex interconnections, of course, between Germany, the United States, and Europe as a whole, because objectively the German question has been central, especially in the last couple of hundred years, as far as, in fact, the broader balance in Europe and in the world was concerned. There are many interesting considerations that we could make about this, but realizing that this stuff started in the 10th century in some way is worth appreciating. Today we don't talk about the ethnogenesis. We will surely make videos in which we'll explain, like, where, can we talk about, for example, Eastern Frank in terms of modern German, but to which extent, right? Because you know that I'm a beyond right-wing person, let's put it in this way, but so beyond that, very often the scale of brutality of things I say puzzles even those who think that they're actually owning extremistic ideas, except I presume I stick to to some higher standards. It's also more objective and righteous one, but I couldn't do otherwise, because otherwise I wouldn't make 1,600 videos on YouTube. As you understand, you must have some ego to do this. It's not that I even particularly have a huge one, but that I can't be that ruthless in many ways. And as a medievalist, of course, I encountered an historiographical approach that always says, oh, it's a problem. We can't really say whether it was a continuity, say, from Clovis times to the French monarchy, what we call the French monarchy, and of course the Merovingian or the Frankish or whatever, and the French state, whatever. I personally, the more I studied history, and because I'm very much against, as I was saying before, to any form of nationalism and socialism, because I consider them as a cultural abortion of essentially the putrefaction of universal tradition, and thus also the concept of nation state per se, because nobody wants to deny the let's say the identities, but the identities, in my opinion, are relevant only if they have any worth. And of course, any modern country today is just a sewer per se, ideologically. The question, whichever it is, by the way, all over the world, and thus I find it rather pathetic, as I was saying at the beginning, that we need to, like, saying, put the contemporary flag of a country on something that not much was banally 1,000 years ago, because you must give some evidence for that, and that's what I actually try to do. But because, again, knowing what that thing was, it has nothing to do. There was no ideological compatibility of any traits with that kind of contemporary ideology. But it is important to get the degree by which, of course, what would become, for this example, a contemporary reality, had to do with the time, because things didn't just happen overnight, nor particularly long times are necessarily enough to erase certain specific characters of certain populations, right? When I was younger, I thought that, since I didn't know a lot of things, after all, I left a general benefit of the doubt by saying, probably, I don't want to be too harsh. The question is, okay, you shouldn't be too harsh if you don't know things, if you can't provide with an objective judgment, but why wouldn't you think that things are actually better or worse than they actually are? But since we're too paranoid because we're being told that we don't have to be, that's the other thing, being racist, even though to me racism is literally the 19th century pseudo-scientific ideology that has nothing to do with saying, to me, a certain country is disgusting, for example. If you have some valid standards, frankly, hurting somebody's feeling is one of the least of my concerns. But the question is, the thing, again, did happen at some point. And the mechanism in saying, for example, there is a huge continuity, mystically, spiritually, identically, with properly the concept of how the Merovingian dynasty and monarchy and empire have been established, right? That also invests this other, the other countries that eventually inherited this, right? And the mechanism is crucial in the 10th century because the 10th century allows you to see how old certain continuities were, but also how, not randomly, because there is always a political, social reason, but let's say still by which degree and for which reasons took that form, right, and substance. This is crucial because, again, especially in the case of, but this is valid for every place, telling the truth. There were countries where somehow more unitary than others, etc. Sometimes we also get confused by the degree of political fragmentation. And I think also the 10th century is just a big slap in the face of whoever thinks that simply something that is fragmented per se doesn't have actually a core identity. Right? 10th century Europe is the perfect example because it's literally from this blob that Western civilization boomed but by far, by a scale that is not witnessed historically with the same rate. And that's also not necessarily, on the top of all things, just an indicator of absolute quality. Today, I don't want to make a millenary universal history because it's already complicated to deliver these concepts. But let's say what was happening there in the collapse of a major system, but also in the reconstruction of others, is something that can make us closer to the awareness, in fact, that most of the, say, political, national, cultural references that we misuse today are, in fact, just imaginary, are just some distraction. And they don't take in account the essence of a real civilization. There are many anecdotes that I could tell you, such as, I don't know, I did meet contemporaneous historians that said, but how did they make it in the Middle Ages to govern if they didn't have a state? Well, welcome to one of the major chapters, kind of medieval, just, I don't know, law or whatever you want to study, you want to learn. Because we are completely dishabituated to think that, for example, without a state, things cannot work. Many people, especially conservatives today, presume that the state per se is a negative thing. They haven't understood anything either, right? It's always double-threaded. It never works like, I will just buy this or that, and so it will make it, right? That is a complete denial of universal tradition per se. States actually do reflect the magnitude in scale of a civilization. I mean, all great civilizations were states. They weren't just some weird stuff. What we should do better is defining what is a state, right? That also at the time arguably existed. We're talking about a hierarchy, we're talking about the moral load that it has. You can have the most statalistic systems actually performing rather well, right? And others that are complete sewers. And actually contemporary history provides us with, say, statalistic systems are never quite a good states, let's say better, but the states that are real states, also with an important degree of centralization, whatever. And I promise that I will talk about this at some other point too, because it's speaking especially to an American audience, that the idea of a statal overlordship sounds like the perfect tyranny and villainy, and the more you can add to that negative stereotype, the better it is. It's not about that. It's about the moral quality of the people. It has nothing to do with the system per se. The system does influence the thing, but it's still through the means used by people, not through the empty shell per se. And what you actually see at the roots of this high medieval European revival, actually, because we have basically assessed quite well that the so-called revival of the year 1000 actually started heavily in the 10th century. Well, I mean, it was undergoing also before, since the 8th that we see pretty good indicator. The so-called Dark Ages actually lasted at the longest 1 century and a half, right? Then things began to evolve, and when they began to evolve, there was still a power that was fundamentally emerging as such on other people that were conferring their power to them. That's yet another concept that is often misunderstood. This is part of contractualism, but I don't know why there is so much Hobbesian paranoia and actual, political surrealism to pretend that people that give some right eventually to the state eventually can't get it back. Right? Again, it's always the people's fault, and what people behave and do, and what they do it for. Right? And there is hardly anything heroic about countering or not countering a state sometimes. And again, that's where the double threat should be better understood. One could read it also in a Christian way, because, say, from a political institutional point of view, the concept of kingship and earthly and divine power were being investigated thoroughly at this point, and they provided you with some of the most coherent interpretations of that. I mean, you still find people who literally say, but the Bible says not to kill. As if, in that sense, killing cannot be done in absolute terms. And the Bible doesn't say that at all. But that's in fact literalism, and that's the level of cultural flattening that we're witnessing nowadays. The 10th century, we made multiple videos about this, is also the century of the creation of the militia, right? So what we basically understand as the European feudal nobility, right? The term feudal is, if you want, criticizable per se, but it's essentially what it was becoming, even in, retrospectively. And so the definition of a knightly elite, that was literally the one summing up all the political, military, and social power. That is to say, all the system revolved around these knights. And this means that all the system was supporting this. Because knights alone were not enough to support power. And we will see it today, also from a monarchic perspective, not just because kings were knights and considered often as just primi inter pares, but because alone, monarchs didn't have much of a power, and instead they radically strengthened it. And that's where the role of the aristocracies and all those who actually control more directly the territory is to be assessed. Again, really, there's plenty of videos about this phase in the post-Carolingian playlist, so I will not digress further on this. You can check that out, and we'll come back very, very often on this topic, because it's really worth of enormous consideration. In any case, while we can see definitely that Western Francia, Eastern Francia more or less set the basis of what we see in today, France or Germany, We also see that the forces at work in this successor kingdoms of Charlemagne's empire could have easily led to other outcomes. And disgregatively speaking, let's be honest about this. We've made lots of videos about these various kingdoms, listed their characteristics. What we call France is basically the product of an imperialistic, systematic subjugation of the lands that belong technically to Western Francia, but plus Brittany, plus an important amount, even of saying what was Lotharingia, but even parts of the same Germany, Burgundy. Also, it kept out everything the south of the Pyrenees, so you understand it's not exactly the same thing, and still it took an enormous time before this could be accomplished, right? It's only in the 13th century that the Capetians managed to extend power more or less all the entirety of this territory. Germany is also a bit more fictitious, as the ethnic duchies per se were the proof, of course, of some pre-existing identities that hardly had much in common before. Like the Germans, if as a Central European population, at least in the ancient meaning of the Germans, were scattered in a very different way compared to what, of course, the modern country became. Plus, they migrated further to other areas. Some areas were, of course, they occupied areas as far as Poland, for example, and or other, even as far as the Black Sea. And then you have, some move. Then there is a Slavization up to the Elbe, and then there are some local creations by the Merovingian empire, such as Bavaria, for example, that especially in that position wouldn't exist otherwise. There is an incredibly complicated set of circumstances that would make the boundaries of Germany the ones that more or less we don't even see, because, as you know, before World War I and the Second, also things were fundamentally still reminiscent of a previous reality where actual what we call German powers had built most of their power out of Germany, such as Prussia and Austria that ruled most, in fact, on Poland, on Hungary, extensionally, right? Even though they were German powers themselves. There is all the question that we will see, in fact, of the Holy Roman Empire. Also this kind of German-Italian axis that formed, accidentally. I mean, what if the Western Franks had actually maintained, as for, again, reasons that would recur historically, also would have been kind of more probable, after all. And why did it sediment in the 10th century like that? Because, again, the empire was universal, so technically even the Western Franks could claim imperial title, and they wouldn't, or at least at some point they even tried. I mean, Francis I competed with Charles V over the title of King of Germany at that point, and Holy Roman Emperor, had that been accomplished. So it's way more complex than it sounds, and probably a German identity between these chunks of peoples that had, again, very scarcely to do with each other, even less than say Neustria had to do with Aquitaine, right? Started remaining for reasons that we will see better. We have already seen also in videos about Eastern Frankish history. However, suspense in this area that was somehow different from the West by degree, especially of feudalization. From the East, because those were still kind of more tribes, Germany was a bit in between, and it began to coalesce in that game mechanism. Also because it was exposed to certain particular enemies, especially during the 10th century, because in fact they were close to Italy, but the Western Franks were busy in actually being much more advantaged in terms of dynastic state power building, at least, than the Eastern Franks. But exactly for that, they were involved in pretty hard work where they were, and the thing ultimately sedimented like that. It's really monastic centers that were also coping part of re-elaborating part of the classical insight, ethnographic insight, that the concept of Teutonic kingdom. There's also a synecdoche. Well, what did the Austrians do with the Teutons, right, or the Rhinelanders, right? That's a quite interesting way of culture building. And then you have, of course, Burgundy, Italy. We will see them now. But even in that case, states that at some point seemed even better put from, for example, from a civil point of view, than and with better surviving chances than, especially than France. Like it was Western Francia, paradoxically, so the country would consolidate the most eventually, historically. That was the one that risked the most not existing as a unitary power. Burgundy, for example, didn't have such a bad base, but eventually lost the chance. There are very random events that brought to the creation even of certain powers. Like think about the Duchy of Burgundy, for example, that area we have seen as a frontier between the Kingdom of Burgundy, the Kingdom of France, even parts of Germany, and that became one of the major players eventually in late medieval France, and changed all history in a way. Well, that could have gone in another way. There were some members of the Anscarian Mark that at some point could unify the Burgundian power and even hegemonizing what would become the Duchy of Burgundy, maybe just for banal dynastic, biological reasons. They wouldn't accomplish this. The Italic Kingdom had some relevant nobility quarreling with each other for the imperial title, as a matter of fact. It would have been easier, if you think about it, just because they were from the other side of the Alps, monopolizing the, in fact, the imperial title, given the proximity with Rome, but also overlapping with that what had been the Longobards kingdom, but in civil, juridical terms, were particularly advanced, and especially in a central and unitary sense, contrarily wise to what was believed at least 70 years ago, and not even update historiography knowledge and awareness, because certain mistakes are really unforgivable. And yet, as you know, it collapsed. Right, the entire feudal system shrank because eventually it was the city, the communes that would rise, and albeit being quite powerful on their own, managing even to keep the Germans out, they were still basically 30 statelets on their own. Interestingly enough, the Kingdom of Italy, however, surviving as a major element of the empire because it was functional to the imperial crowning, while Burgundy, for example, disappeared completely, even though it was properly a legitimate kingdom within, by the way, also incorporated like Italy in the 10th century by the Teutonians under this German empire, right? So, and plus there are, and this is just to remain to the post-Carolingian realms. Lotharingia basically was hegemonized by the Eastern Franks, and that is also interesting because, as we will see now, there was a great proximity between the Western and Eastern Frankish courts, also in a competitive sense, of course, but with that hybridizing consequence in the 10th century. So things are somehow complicated, right? And if we had looked at the 10th century picture of post-Carolingian, especially of Eastern and Western Francia from a monarchic perspective, and not much just because of the Lotharingia in between, but just because this was considered still the broader Frankish Empire by legacy. You realize that the Frankish elites, both East and West, and thus unavoidably the kingdoms they sustained remained bound together, importantly enough, frontierless. That's yet another crucial concept. You know that even in medieval times, the Rhine, for example, had nothing to do with a frontier, right? Because the frontier was west, just like it's actually remained today. In the east, it's different because it was all more open, as we will see now. But for example, the marriage of Otto I's sister to the West Frankish king Louis IV, is a good symptom and agency of the close entente that came close to Ottonian hegemony in the mid-century. I made a video about Otto III just the other week. And dynastically speaking, somebody could have claimed from Germany or from France, the succession, the male dynastically, the typical Frankish succession system of primogeniture on both countries. But the concept of, for example, the original Frankish monarchy superstate could have given life to another reality, to other countries. I mean, if the balance had been changed at that point, why would, for example, a country like the Netherlands or Belgium or Luxembourg have to exist? Or even Switzerland, right? It's not obvious. It's not obvious at all, as it wasn't at the time, nor when these countries even formed much later, during the late Middle Ages, during the modern age. For them, this was particularly important because we are heavily biased by, again, the 19th century nation-state idea and maps even of that shows you these boundaries in black. They're very neat, very clear, and then the thing within the perimeter all colored in one homogeneous pattern, right? And so you say, okay, this big thing is just that, and I can mimify that, right? At the time, first of all, of course, not even today's reality is anything like this, but at the time, this concept properly did not exist. Power was considered, in an imperial universal sense. Even the 843 Verdun partitions weren't at all so like, okay, now we distinguish the fact that we chose the eastern chunk because it's just kind of more Germanic, or it has something with it, or the west is. Of course, there was something to it, but even the actual boundaries that were drawn, there would be drawn and redrawn, because we just mentioned Verdun, but there were lots of other treaties, the one of Mers and the one, and they always change something if you look at them carefully, and that thing at some point definitively impressed some borders that eventually evolved, because they wouldn't stay exactly what they were in Carolingian times, but still gave, for example, sometimes could make the difference in that frontier areas, also in terms of which local polities would form and so on. It was relatively just, okay, I get this, you get that. Just the other day we were talking about how even the definition of Carolingian boundaries had been done, right? And how, of course, it would be very interesting to get in a Carolingian mentality and say, okay, how do I handle a country of some sort, right? Because you have been there, you've been fighting there, you've been organizing all the logistics for the armies, you have summoned, you have negotiated with the local aristocracy. You see those countries in a way that even, studying this stuff today, we have no chance of really picturing the way they did. So when they made these agreements, they meant something that has very loosely to do with, again, our 843 map of Europe. Look at the partition of the three chunks. We don't see it in the way they saw, and this does affect our historiographical insight. The other great element, of course, is the elites. We have been completely de-habituated to understand that powers are not powers because there is just the guy at the top, and the rest just obeys. Any system works exclusively with the decisive moral force majority of the population, right? Mostly it's an elite world because essentially France exports this somehow. It is feudalism. You can't call it more elegantly vassalic beneficiary system, but it's what it's becoming. France was brutally advantaged in that because, again, no country in Europe had the degree of large estates in the hands of just a handful of people. I'm exaggerating handful, of course. There were lots of various powers, but everything was so hierarchical and technically understood as a private possession of a major overlord, right? Since Gallo-Roman Frankish times, not even before, right? You can even observe some characters even before the Roman conquest in that Gallic reality that weren't quite the same, nor in Eastern Francia, nor in the Italic kingdom. And that, however, the Franks, by conquering these two regions, had exported significantly, altering, sometimes also brutally, especially in, as you know, in countries like Saxony. But don't underestimate the impact, for example, of the conquest of the Lombard kingdom in there, and somehow created, in fact, what we observe at that point in post-Carolingian uniform sense, the milites establishment, right? It was pretty much the same everywhere, right? The Western European knight emerges from that system. It doesn't matter whether later they would believe either in a castle in the countryside or in a house tower in a city. They were literally the same people in everything, right? And especially in their overwhelming power. Differences, of course, existed too, but the essence of their nature is the same. Thus, when you look at the objective fact that these regna that formed after the disgregation of the empire didn't have much power at all, exactly because the elites had taken it over, in absence of a real state, but especially a power could sustain it as such, right? But the power, the forces were there. The same empire that had conquered this world thing were still there. And the reason why this falls apart is that they have overstretched their conquests. So internally, they don't know where to turn anymore, and there is not like another backbone, skeleton, public authority, state, whatever. So they start just fighting against each other, but preserving the same regna. What is really striking of all this, and we've seen often, is that the concept of you would say it's just a chaos, right? An anarchy, a far west of some sort. Actually, all these, as Regino of Prum was actually observing before, regna and reges as a consequence, but also the imperium. Imperium meant also not just like the God-given power, but properly a political territorial reality that, of course, is the heir of the Carolingian Empire per se, of this Frankish power, survives. The institution remains, and it remains because the elites, the aristocracy, makes it remain. When I say the elite, the aristocracy, I mean literally everyone, because this elite and aristocracy in turn existed just because it did receive support, right? Especially and this was a military aristocracy, let's stress it, more than any other, arguably, that had ever existed, given the degree of professionalism, de facto they owned. That, in a time of Viking, Magyar, and Saracen invasions, was, of course, very important to own as such. And this is an aristocracy that manages to work. Again, this sometimes even impressive political territorial domination, sometimes in a very random way. Sometimes they're just episcopates. Sometimes they're just, they're even abbots sometimes. They mostly are, of course, stemming from these public districts of the Carolingian era that somehow overlapped essentially the previous Roman diocesan one, too. But it also evolved with, again, as some dynastic possessions scattered sometimes over an incredibly articulated amount of territory you can't even properly represent on a map, even had we the entirety of our of the data that unfortunately is lacking too often. But that was this pervasive scenery that of course overlapped dramatically with lots of others at the time. And that brought this whole mechanism in motion to reorganize, to readministrate, to encapsulate. It's been demonstrated that most of the encapsulation that, as you know, took place during the 10th century in Europe was not even due to external aggression. Normally, the fortresses against the heathens were built temporarily, right? In some places that were just very strategic, again, for this external attack that, yes, happened a lot, but if you actually pin a single place in Europe, it's not that they would happen every year, right? They may happen even at a distance of decades, etc. So they were relatively occasional, so it would damage the entire thing. But most of the forces were within Europe, were not from the surroundings. The surroundings just came to interfere because they saw the system was destabilized. But as soon as, by the year 1000, this greater polis had recompacted, you see a crisis. You see the taming of all of the Norse, of the Magyars, of the Saracens. Because, of course, this continental blob was actually much more of a pervasive, powerful, and resistant glue than anything basically that had been forming. And even the collapse, for example, of the Caliphate of Cordoba, even the relative feudalization of the Byzantine Empire that de facto abandons that rigid kind of bureaucratic statalistic system by a degree. At the same collapse of the, let's say, of the Islamic Golden Age, right? The crisis of the Abbasid Caliphate against this kind of more, in fact, feudal private Turkic mercenaries is similar, even somehow, to the pattern that Europe had already taken, however, but by consolidating through that previously. And this has also a lot to do with the further success of European civilization later, and this is somehow overlooked. When we, of course, speaking of identity, this is also particularly important. How aware were the local aristocracies of the for example, of the Frankish legacy, right? Because if you look at the Frankish legacy was paradoxically mostly felt in Lotharingia, right? Because that was the true center of the empire. Like the Carolingian Empire had was mostly based in roughly today's northeastern France, Belgium, right? Those areas, also partly Western Germany. In fact, Aachen was built there, as you know, as a model of Rome, with the Palatium, etc. But that was the area that evaporated the first. That is interesting. Today we won't talk about this. Part of the reason was that indeed the military needs were greater, paradoxically, on the extreme frontiers in some way, or at least from areas where you could could maintain a center of power to intervene that far away. But again, it's not that simple either, because the defensive needs, for example, of Germany were greater. This is for example, a factor that surely helped eventually making the Renovatio Imperii starting from there as opposed to France, that was somehow more sheltered from once basically the Viking incursions were over, especially as far as the Carpathians were concerned, were mostly, as you know, already at the time a Parisian power, right? But for example, what about the northern eastern Frankish mark of the Billungs in East Saxon, in a land that was practically something like an hybrid between German and Slav, and that was still coping with these important problems of colonization in the Norse proximity, and just from a locally aristocratic perspective, what was like the Frankish memory connected with? Because some of those peoples had not even been part of the Carolingian Empire, and those who had been part of it were often probably more remembering how the Saxons had been tamed by the Carolingians, right? Those northeastern German marches, we made a video about the one of Brandenburg, but we will have to do for the one of the buildings. There is Meissen, etc. Those are interesting because they took centuries to consolidate, even as concrete powers. I mean, some of them actually would even be absorbed by others. But it was particularly difficult there to centralize, maintain a stable power. Or what about the Poitevin dukes of Aquitaine? That instead were actually a huge power. Like before the Arab invasion and the Battle of Tours, when the Franks managed to basically take over the same country, like. And thus, as the major competitors with the Aquitanians, how would these dukes feel themselves, like in the 10th century, right? We made a video about southwestern Franken in the 10th century. We've seen how, when the Carpathians, for example, rise to power, so because they did it in a somehow unlawful way, they literally, except for the Catalonian countries that remained somehow more connected with Paris, because they were less threatened by it. It's simple as that. Basically, all the Occitanians stop even counting in their historiography, in the Annales, for example, the years with the reign of the kings, right? They properly say we have nothing to do with the French, because those were another people. Like Occitania is not northern France, right? France, the Langue de Ville, is fundamentally another thing, as you know, from the south. And so what was, in a country like Aquitaine, really the Frankish authority perceived? Probably was perceived more, say, that among the Billungs, but it was more ideologically adverse, right? The Billungs may have even been more supportive of that Frankish legacy, as distant as it sounded, because it was still just the only one who could bring could leave some space at least for self-legitimization of some sort. The Aquitanians just wanted, presumably, to be left alone, right? As they had always hated Frankish gods, and they had been somehow rich and powerful enough to aim at an important autonomy, also with important ambitions on their own, even though eventually they just became some of those great, this case a duchy, or one of the great duchies and counties that made a patchwork at the end of the 10th century is really France was. And this is important in the pan-Frankish perspective. Again, it's obvious that the Ottonians and the Carpathians had a broader universal objective, because they were at the top. They saw more distantly, and they had enough power to claim a greater part of that imperial legacy. And in the case of the Ottonians, even actually revitalizing it importantly after a phase of practically of lack, even of a true imperial center of any sort, that they had become for the first time after the Carolingians. this is the picture. During the 10th century, the western and eastern Frankish kings didn't have the resources that the Carolingians had, right? They also weren't so eager to plunder, to demand tributes, or even to territorially expand, because this could have turned all their subjects against them, because these were cultivating some important ideas of themselves, of prerogatives. The same, again, nobility that establishes itself is in part developing internationally as a recognition of each other's status, a way to be like almost kind of an international law regarding what, in fact, nobility really was about. It would remain for most of the Ancien regime the base, really, of European identity, right? So what actually some powers survived like during the 10th century, especially the Capetians, was paradoxically the threat posed by their same vassals to other vassals and/or subjects. For example, the same Viking incursions in Western Francia seemingly strengthened monarchic power. Not because kings were able to do that much. Yes, objectively they managed to fortify the sand to prevent, the Norse to at least damage further that the only area that they actually controlled, and gradually pushing them more, increasingly more towards the British Isles. But raids elsewhere had also highlighted how the nobility as a whole sometimes could even side with the Norse, because they perfectly knew that these were just pirates. They didn't have any broader capacity to conquer, to settle, unless, that's the only case is exactly by monarchic concession on the lower Seine. It's a specific, it's actually a bright move, right? It would cause eventually, for 100 years, the rivalry between the King of France and the Duke of Normandy. But it still kind of stopped Viking incursions and somehow allowed to stabilize an important part of France. It was also, in fact, close to the one directly controlled by the Capetians. But the nobility was behaving, in this sense, in a savage way. They were actually the robbers, the ones that were increasing disproportionately their power at the expenses of the people that sustained most of the cost of this perennial conflict. It was, again, mostly also one between the various barons rather than from foreign invaders. And in this, the subjects developed a kind of faith or support of even of ideology in favor of the king, because the king was in many ways, just as the top authority, the only one that could have a dialogue with the nobility, that could sell official titles that these were hungry of, that could that could officialize certain powers that would be eventually the same nobiliar ones, but at the expense of the smaller ones that were also the most anarchic, the most difficult to tame. If you actually look at their individual perspectives, you realize that they were extremely logic, right? They were hardly just bunch of weird bloodthirsty individuals. They were all doing that with a very specific, sometimes out of just it was the only way of surviving, because it was a fierce competition, and no wonder that the elite militarized dramatically, even more than they had been in Carolingian times, because it was all about war in many ways. So especially this process of conferring, withholding, and redistributing comital office, so the major power district control to the various nobility, trying to say make actually some to co-opt, as we've seen, some of the most powerful one, more rarely breaking them. Because again, the first need was to compact power, not to disgregate further, because that was exactly the point. It was a push coming a bit from everyone, right? Just people want a stable political and social system. The problem is that if you don't have a major lordship, like the Carolingian one had been for having plundered, looted, exacted tributes again, expanded, enslaved, now who could do it? It was the same lasting kings that and this multitude of noblemen that had to make it work. It would take generations, right? And most of this state consolidation was, however, autonomous, right? The great counties, duchies that formed at this time mostly did so through a private channel dynamic. And as a consequence, aristocrats' own regional power always tended to become entrenched. That's where properly the banal lordship is established. There is essentially a standard for which the core lands, possessions of the lords cannot be touched, even by the king. This is a very important change from Carolingian times. After all, we're still following that Roman Germanic idea that from one side it was a public domain, and this, however, belonged privately to the king, and so everybody living on it could have their own goods, but fundamentally they owed their goods as such to the king, because goods power meant land owning, demands, right? So in high medieval times, you find the king literally buying power by saying, okay, by royal authority, I will swear that essentially there is a core of this of your local lordship cannot be touched. And nobody can, even a king or an emperor, can take you, can strip you off. And consider, I don't know, still at the time of Frederick Barbarossa and Henry the Lion of Saxony, like this thing of the allodium is a huge deal institutionally, because the nobility, the establishment that forms itself in high medieval Europe is basically founded on these prerogatives, on these privileges, and also by this de facto power. Because it's obvious that smaller nobility, sank over time, over the centuries, but this meant also that somebody else took their place. So in many ways, it could be the same monarchy, because the same kings were pursuing the same identical policies of the rest of the nobility on their own account, in their own private dynastic domains. But other noblemen were creating equally some states within states. And as such, were very complicated to dislodge. Were great vassals that were even more powerful than the king. Look at France, for example. But there wasn't, everything rested on this feudal bond, right? So everything could be destabilized after all. Even if we look at those duchies and counties and they seem big on the map, still these powers had the same problems internally that the kingdom and the monarch had internally. There were, to complicate further the question, but exactly as one of the most successful patrimonial strategies of the time, the foundations of lot of house monasteries, the establishment of privatized cults of saints reproducing in their patrimonies the local dominion effected by each royal dynasty's religious patronage in its heartlands. Thus, the investment of huge resources in goods that could properly not be even, nobody could even thought it could be ever touched. Like an allodium in theory could still pass to somebody else. The church property, not. Because the church, even though was not a monarchy yet, was still the church. Didn't have the same successory mechanisms, nor it technically belonged to the regnum per se, right? It was Christ's. And as such, literally nobody could interfere with those possessions, especially at this time. Like in more modern times, of course, it would be a lot of lands confiscation. I mean, the St. Carolingians had done this back in the day, mostly because some clergymen had usurped royal land, because that's where the Merovingians during the crisis had let happening to cope these very powerful individuals. At this point, it's different because the papacy has acquired a greater grip on the imperial authority, and vice versa, and thus, in order to legitimize each other, also the church patrimonies, differently from the lay ones, were consolidating faster than, in fact, the former, right? Naturally, the church paid, however, in the fact that they couldn't administer, for example, higher justice, they couldn't, in theory at least, sentence somebody to death. They always needed a lay representative, advocates. These were other noblemen. So even though some areas of Europe had warlike clergy, and it was somehow normal because the clergy still had children, just they couldn't inherit the office. The ecclesiastical principalities were on average weaker, right? On average less militarized, on average thus more threatened, and that by the lay nobility, and that's also why the church stuck to the monarchy most of the times, because they knew that by supporting it they could actually get a more powerful protector, and that's in part also how these monarchies stood on their feet. Naturally, the church in this demanded a lot in exchange as well, and that's where you see those vase principalities, that ecclesiastical principalities, especially in the most fragmented areas, were powerful, right? Think about Germany especially, where you have a lot of, in fact, ecclesiastical principalities are also pretty warlike because the situation is much more unstable, unitarily speaking. It's a land that, again, takes more time in the first place to even feudalize, and so it has to undergo later than all others this same mechanism, and so there you have blurring between the lay and the ecclesiastical, more but by some degree. As we were saying at the beginning of the video, the peak of political disgregation in both Western and Eastern Francia is roughly the 20s, the 10s, the 20s of the 10th century. It was a critical moment in which things could really shipwreck, royally wise, and where you realize that, again, everything was fluid, that the kingdoms that eventually merged as they did were somehow accidentally shaped that way or had that specific degree of power and so on, right? Districts, yes, were taken seriously as much as the royal institution, but how powerful this could be to hold everything together, nobody yet knew, right? Especially the Burgundian and the Italic examples showed this. But again, even just the differences between the West and the East are quite relevant. By the year 1000, you have something else. You have properly an international order of universally recognized kingdoms that are literally taking it to the next step. There is a universal hierarchy, empire, papacy, defined kingdoms. There are strong political, institutional, I would say, developments and also recognitions internationally, and the system is growing. within that channel, right? So an incredible accomplishment considering what was happening just a few generations before. So this change, as we were recalling, cannot be attributed to the monarchies per se, right? Especially in West Francia, you realize that royal resources were lacking badly, right? There were more resources actually than in any other post-Carolingian kingdoms. So exactly for this reason, every nobleman could do a bit more on their own, but also beginning to subjugate more, like in a more hierarchical fashion, the surroundings. In Germany, what you have instead is a major threat posed by the Magyar invasions that were by far the most serious among the three, and that definitely did risk to compromise the political and institutional integrity of the eastern duchies. Saxony, Thuringia, and Bavaria could essentially collapse. That could become kind of a failed state area that surely would have consolidated on some pattern, but not the most evident ones that we observe in Eastern Germany, say already, a couple of centuries later, right? Exactly to stop this, which had been rendered possible by actually part of the Eastern Frankish nobility siding with the Magyars or letting them pass just to damage royal power, not to concentrate and centralize too much. The thing started becoming so destructive, the same aristocracy said, you know what, let's unite, let's confer power to the more effective ruler, more warlike one. It was incidentally the Duke of Saxony, and that's how the Ottonians came to power, because they first of all managed to defeat the Magyars in open field, which was a huge deal, and then to bring these military forces abroad, to Italy specifically, to take the imperial crown, and to actually connect, as we will see, the Italic kingdom to Germany under the Ottonian Empire, right? But still somehow floating over these systems. Again, it's the local aristocracies that rendered this possible. The local aristocracies accept to give the Ottonians power, both in Germany and in Italy. In Germany, more or less the Ottonians rely on the Saxon and Franconian power bases, because the Saxon ones were the ancestral and kind of military ones, while the Franconians were the ones of, the most advanced in Germany, actually, the ones that just by name bore the legacy of the Frankish grandeur. The rest is not really controlled by the Ottonians in a direct territorial sense. The same goes for Italy. What the Ottonians actually do there is they reconfirm the local rulers, namely the bishops in the cities, because there were lay rural aristocrats who were kind of not happy that now these Saxons had come in the peninsula, where the local nobility in fact was actually just quarreling for getting the imperial crown on its own, and conferring comital power to those bishops. That is to say, instead than appointing a lay aristocrat in charge of the district that corresponded to the ancient, again, Romano-Germanic repartition, diocese, etc., where the city was the center of. It appoints, simply says, okay, bishop, you are the count now. You have comital power. You are the one who holds it. And in this way, the Ottonians managed to get to Rome, and to, of course, create essentially, like in all these countries, a pro and an against party that will keep fighting, will keep creating problems, of course, everywhere in all this post-Carolingian world, but that still, by having this bipolarization, develops from both sides further some political and institutional power and state building of some sort. All this, Carolingian legacy was ideologically crucial because there was practically no other precedent to claim the imperium per se. It was the papacy that had conferred Charlemagne with the imperial title that was plus essentially intended, even though up to Ottonian times vaguely, as Roman, not least possibly so, because first of all the Carolingians had considered themselves ruling over a Frankish empire, not a Roman empire. It's the Ottonians that, rather than considering themselves ruling over a Saxon empire, they consider themselves ruling over a Roman empire, and that resume ideologically to the extreme that degree of universal power, exactly because they were managing to aim at that. They had reconquered Italy, they had married a Byzantine princess, as we've seen exactly again in that video about Otto III the other day, about even the Byzantine imperial influence on ideological influence on you understood, on Western imperial ideology. So it was a moment of huge re-expansion. In all this, as we will see, Latin Christendom was essentially winning the race of the conversion of the Central European peoples, so that we will see now Poland and Hungary there were not just a success of the Ottonian Empire that managed fundamentally to draw it into the German orbit, but also a papal Roman one over Constantinople, significantly speaking. Speaking of the Longobards kingdom, we've seen what it was. Essentially, this was the Regnum Italiae, because the Carolingians had tried to stress mostly the geographical aspect of it to erase a bit the Longobard legacy and to make it appear like more of a Frankish possession. The Italic kingdom became part of the Ottonian Empire in the way we have seen, and yet it was a very particular one on its own, as we have often described. Was more urbanized, was more literate, more kind of paradoxically, it was more statally administered, but also less centralized, because it was the city that really ruled territorially, or at least the local diocese, and in the following century the communes will start appearing as basically a local municipal government, making, as we've seen, sensibly substituting themselves even to that aforementioned comital power that had been conferred by the Ottonians. As such, the long-term disunity, at least in terms of unitary of government properly, was further crystallized in the Italic kingdom, right? That maintained these very distinct specific forms of devolved and native power, right? That would maintain it fundamentally autonomous for most of this period. As far as the south of the peninsula is concerned, you know that it was some very complicated mix of Byzantines, Longobards, Arabs, and that, of course, the Germanic Empire at this point, we can say, did interfere, but never quite managed to reach and consolidate consistently, so that things in the 11th century actually would be taken over by the Normans, as you know, that were not part of the empire, but they were papal vassals, interestingly enough, and they did with Sicily something very interesting in terms of personal assets as with England, because they were basically countries, in fact, that hadn't belonged nor to the empire, nor they had been feudalized. So they actually were turned into models of centralization by Latin Germanic standards. Thus, what takes place, as you know, quite macroscopically, is this major settlement between Western and Eastern Francia. The Western Frankish kings basically cannot afford to launch a major kind of imperial ideological policy, because they control barely just the Ile-de-France and some other parts. They are very powerful locally, Sometimes they even have, in fact, in this sense, more power hierarchically than even some that the emperors have in Germany. But they just can't. They're squeezed. They're choked by these other very tough vassals that are all around, and they will just gradually achieve a space on their own. But you have to wait the 13th century before France surpasses again. Remember that there had been actually a Western Frankish emperor that was Charles the Bald, right? They actually both the Western Frankish and Eastern Frankish army had descended in Italy. They were about to make the greatest Carolingian bath of blood, even more than Fontenoy, but they decided better to say, okay, Charles the Bald takes the imperial crown, but he promises not to actually step in Italy. And as Germans, we will also come back north of the Alps. And so it happens also because in the later reign of Charles the Bald, that, as you know, was basically also the last Carolingian of his generation, France was starting to create a lot of problems, right? We've seen it in the video about the capitulary of Quercy-sur-Oise, that is essentially the inheritance of the major fiefs, like together with Conrad II in 1037, with the Edictum de Beneficiis, instead with the inheritance of the lesser fiefs. And that's it, right? So by the 10th century, there is nothing the Western Franks can do to prevent the Ottonians from essentially undertaking again the Italian adventure and securing their power over, like, traditionally, by no other formal mechanism, but having literally gone to Italy to be crowned by the Pope as emperors, and having de facto been orientatively recognized from that direction, right? Because in theory, the Western Franks, but any, even again, there had been some Italian emperors as well. Even in the future, there will be other foreign kings of the Romans, non-German emperors as well. But the axis established between Germany and Italy will last until the 19th century, and the Holy Roman Empire is basically that one. Burgundy also basically disappears. Just the Kingdom of Bohemia will be added later, as you know, and of course other lesser polities, but we're talking mostly about realms here. But those crowns did remain historically. As far as Burgundy is concerned, instead, as we've seen, there was an initial, good position actually that this kingdom had. At some point, the same Burgundian rulers, namely, actually at that point there had already been a split between Upper and Lower Burgundy, but the Counts of Arles had managed to be crowned by the popes in Rome. We talked about Hugo of Provence, right? There was this broader policy also with Provence, Tuscany, other areas of Italy, but somehow this thing fell. Maybe it's too much of a deterministic explanation, but if you look at Burgundy, it doesn't have this kind of larger valleys like the Seine, the Rhine, the Danube, the Po ones. It's important because there are cities there. It's important for international trade. It's a civilly advanced area, especially the south, especially Provence. But it doesn't have that major land mass and resource accessibility as much as the other post-Carolingian kingdoms. So this thing gradually contracts. There are, as we've seen, vassals there are powers from both all the other post-Carolingian kingdoms that at some point interfere in Burgundy. They start expanding across borders. We've seen the Dauphiné, the other day Savoy, the same rulers of the Duchy of Burgundy at that point basically severed a piece of what was the kingdom and start ruling on its own. The prestige of Burgundy had derived also from the fact that there was a Carolingian branch that had been ruling there at some point, but this went extinguished. And aside from some important local literacy levels, that we can see also expressed in the wake of this Carolingian tradition, in the modes of rulership, in the titles, in the charter, diplomatic signs and symbols, and also the local church's ideological and institutional support, it didn't have any further capacity, and it was hegemonized by the Ottonians as well, and so that it became just like Italy, like something that the German emperor would be called to rule on by default. Again, even in that, we in the late Middle Ages observed the boundary between the Holy Roman Empire and France there, because Burgundy is within the Holy Roman Empire, but technically it was just like a tradition. But the same concept of Holy Roman Empire as a state on its own is just actually the sclerotization of some prerogative that now looked more like the failure of the achievement of the previous universal empire. In fact, the one of Charlemagne in scale will not be achieved by anyone in Europe until Napoleon, right? Destroying the whole Roman Empire, by the way, sadly enough. But it had been established roughly on the base of this 10th century systematization. Now, this is as far as post-Carolingian Europe is concerned. What about the other kingdoms? Because there were other kingdoms in Europe. The most important ones are León-Castile, Denmark, Poland, and Hungary, right? And these were being built at the time, telling the truth. Some of them wouldn't exist for most of the 10th century as kingdoms proper. However, it's this century that defines them for what they would have properly become and remained, even as you understand modern countries. Like León-Castile is the ancestor of just like the Asturias before of the Kingdom of Castile, eventually the one that led the Reconquista and somehow unified at the end of the Middle Ages with Aragon, and so it's mostly today, it would be mostly the ancestor of today's Spain. Denmark is Denmark, Poland is Poland, Hungary is Hungary. And it's interesting that in spite of the border changes that occurred in all of these countries, still, however, they survived, even to things like, Hungary, the Ottoman domination, and Poland, the fact it was literally cancelled from the map at the end of the 18th century, etc. Denmark, as you know, would also quickly reach a sort of imperial, interest on a great part of the Scandinavian coasts, and even on England, right? It was just like an ephemeral dominion, but it still shows how, successful this polity was, and how much also the future history of the country owed to that moment in concentration of power. What is there a common characteristic of these kingdoms? Well, technically, yes. I mean, they were just beyond the frontiers of powerful states, right? So they were the receiving end of their neighbors' aggression. Most of the cases, León-Castile was fighting essentially against the Muslims. Cordoba, as long as it was a unitary power, Denmark was, looked upon with lust by, let's say, by anybody who ruled from Germany since Carolingian times. Poland and Hungary were just a pain in the behind, to say the least, meaning that, say, the Slavic areas were very political, were still somehow tribal, just oligarchies were managing aristocracies to consolidate a power that under Boleslav the Brave would finally be achieved, also with the Christianization and so on. But the fact is that the Magyars, that were, as we've seen, this part of the second invaders, and actually the most threatening, as we've seen also for the aforementioned post-Carolingian order, because they raided everywhere. They raided as far as Spain, in all the post-Carolingian kingdoms, by the way. But they often received support of the Slavs on the eastern frontier of Germany. Here there are also the Bohemians technically, but those wouldn't become, say, kings up to a point. But the Slavs had joined the Magyars in the raids in Germany, right? And so I made a video specifically stressing the overlooked importance of that Germanic, Slavic, Magyar frontier, because it was one of the most viciously traumatic realities that you can ever imagine, right? The fact that it's less documented, for obvious reasons, doesn't mean that it was not really nightmarish to beauty, because again, reconstructing just the military history of those places is extremely fascinating. Nobody cares about that frontier, but it's or at least who does knows to be isolated somehow, and we should recover that properly sense of Central European also identity definition, that if you just consider that the 10th century, the Viking era, and nothing else practically, you humiliate and just don't really make a favor to yourself either in the process. The same goes for the Saracens, right? And I will not digress on the different approaches that are made towards actually pretty similar realities, but just for reasons that have in fact nothing to do with history per se. So one reason why these other kingdoms coalesced was the metus hostilis, was of course the threat posed by their enemies, and thus also the hybrid that this would produce by the copy of essentially the foe's methods by these polities. I don't know, the Danish nobility was, aristocracy was quite receptive since an early age to anything Frankish, just like, could be to anything Roman, even back in the day, because the elites are always more international, more powerful, can afford more, have broader horizons, and make things that way. León-Castile was both influenced by the Muslims and the Franks. Poland and Hungary definitely had quite of an interesting Germanic influence over the centuries. Hungary, in particular, also from the Byzantine Empire, which is fascinating. For not talking about the eastern neighbors, who were somehow steppe peoples, and or other sedentary tribes, such as the Eastern Slavic ones. Britain is an interesting chunk of its own, of course, because the 10th century, as you know, is a defining moment of Englishness. Really, we have seen it for the Battle of Brandenburg, that sense of Anglo-Saxon confidence in asserting what was a purely imperial power on all the British Isles was confirmed and recognized even by their neighbors, right? Always remember this, that as soon as the Anglo-Saxons set foot in Britain, they knew that any other people inhabiting the British archipelago was to become their subjects. All of them. And by the 10th century, the Anglo-Saxon kingdom, as it has factually become out of the Heptarchy, exactly at this point, is coalescing unavoidably, mostly from a Saxon base in the south, because it was more developed and also received, in fact, this greater influences historically from France. Some of the, especially the southeastern Anglo-Saxon powers, we've seen it with the first Kentish monarch, as a matter of fact, in Britain, were Merovingian clients at the time. Some of them had properly migrated from Merovingian lands, so there were deep connections there, important inputs received from the continent, and this formula was winning, right, over especially a north that was frankly the most threatening aspect. I mean, the Midlands, roughly, Northumbria and Mercia, that didn't like this and always opposed themselves and became essentially the gateway for Celts, Norse, and other English rebels to harass the essentially the Wessex monarchic project. In all this, the Welsh and the Scots that were evidently somehow client states of the Anglo-Saxons by some degree, they would be later of the Normans as well, had an opportunity to develop in turn by the same osmotic dynamic a sense of their own identity, a sense of also their own, in fact, monarchy, their institutions that, as primitive and tribal as they substantially were beginning to transition towards something more strictly dynastic, or at least something that could concretize itself around a joint effort of all the various chieftains that inhabited their lands. Right, the sense of royal authority is quite strong, for example, in the reigns of Howell the Good in Wales and Constantine II in Scotland. I made a video about medieval Scotland, in which we talk a little bit about this fact monarchy building that, as you know, takes like a great step forward in the 10th century, exactly under Constantine II. And there is in this Celtic fringe especially an important Norse influence as well that we don't have to underestimate, even in the royal dimension. Right, the Scandinavian kingdoms, doesn't matter how, say, Denmark was factually the only kingdom at this point, but the Scandinavian power was a more markedly and brutally militaristic one than anything that the Celtic fringe saw, right? You know, just look at the Giles and how they fought compared to the Vikings. That definitely were not particularly refined or advanced at so many levels, but military-wise, and thus in terms of that political cohesion, the necessity of being well organized to launch raids, to systematically plunder, to establish some client possessions, and extending this power further, were much more projected towards that process of state building than the Celts were, right? And mostly because their local resources were particularly scarce, to say the least. And so the Scandinavian influence in those wars is even just as a threat, by the way, and obliging them sometimes, as we've seen with Brandenburg, they would side with each other against the Anglo-Saxons, but there were a lot of unhinged chieftains that just went raiding without any control from any higher authority. I mean, the highest authority existed there was the Kingdom of Denmark, that surely didn't enjoy particular centralization in his lands compared to even the Carolingian post-Carolingian standards. So there is all an international game of dynastic alliance, of far-flung waterborne contacts, especially in the north. Also chance through which, especially the English kingdom and the Carolingian traditions began to affect this other polities, and we see definitely from this European continental core all these other peoples around essentially mutuating models of power, etc. Others were, I don't know, the Rus was being influenced by Constantinople, etc. But mostly what was happening in Western Europe was the most impacting, the one that would secure more durably, more quickly, by the way, too, this political institutional development. A word about ethnicity is relevant because, as we were saying before, it's complicated to see a unitary ethnic background in these kingdoms, especially as far as the previous political traditions really were. But it's also wrong to assume that the ethnos didn't play a part in what was properly the juridical identity of the peoples, and thus a base that could help these monarchies to bring them under a single overlordship on an ethnic base. First of all, the Franks had been essentially in the 9th century a Latin Christendom, right? There's no way to see it differently. Their core of power was essentially in the Romance lands. They control mostly a Romance population. They had a Roman papal connection. There was a Mediterranean projection mostly. So that is fair to assess. And it's meaningful that the Franks didn't actually use ethnic epithets in their official titles, right? There was a Frankish empire won by Frankish arms, but it was not ruled by Frankish laws, right? Exactly because of the universal nature of this empire, and also the pragmatic needs of the Carolingian rulers that were, in that sense, quite clever and smart, in spite, again, of the fact that they were just militarily active, that also favored the maintenance of a polyethnic reality, both legally and socially. Like the Franks tried, of course, to bring all these various ethnicities together towards the universal direction, which is literally the meaning of it all. And they let essentially the local peoples to say, okay, you're, say, under Longobards law, okay, you're a Longobard, but you want to use Frankish law, okay, yes, you can. Like, as long as everything, like as the freemen were concerned, you could go by different ethnic identities that were essentially juridically based, because there was hardly any other marker there, and broader, especially broader sense of identity. This is particularly important to stress. It's obvious that there was kind of a sense of greater proximity between places that were more similar or closer. But the way the average person understood its own identity was hardly anything that went beyond a provincial dimension. It was already big, considering the time standards. They could feel they were part of a wall, but they had hardly seen much of this wall or understood much of this wall, and they were more concerned at this point, especially whether, those guys 20 kilometers away under, or maybe just 1 kilometer away from under that other lord's castle were plotting something to steal their cattle, rather than broader, complicated, proto-national, ethnic, juridical issues. They didn't care. Who cared about this was, of course, the elite, because the elite always tried to homogenize, to uniform, to regularize, to order, to rationalize, right? So it's at this point rather that we start seeing something more also ideological regarding the overall identity. For example, it was in the 10th century, from 911 onwards, that the title Rex Francorum became the normal one of the West Frankish kings. A 9th century Carolingian had entitled himself just Rex Dei Gratia, because in those times the concept of Rex was the much more traditional one of essentially a sacred ruler of sorts in virtue of his arms, so a very still kind of almost tribal mentality. And the Franks didn't even have just concurrence for that title. So it was about the progress of that individual that mattered. When you start instead to need your political territorial domination to be more compact around the pattern that, like in this case, who are the Franks? Surely not those who live in Aquitaine or that live in Catalonia. The Franks have literally nothing to do from an ethnic point of view. But it's important to stress that that is Western Francia, also an imperial guise, and that you were still descendants of the Franks that had the great universal empire, and so you will start titling yourself Rex Francorum. And if you wonder why that land is called France, well, it's still today, well, it has much to do with this choice, right? Because this eventually in Germany was not used anymore. And in fact, it's called Germany. That is Deutschland, actually, and stemming even in there from that kind of abbatial classical invention instead, right? And Italy, as we have just seen, it was the older name of the place proper, but it could have called itself Lombardy hadn't the Carolingians changed the name of King of the Longobards to, again, back Kingdom of Italy, right? So literally the names of today's major European countries are after 10th century choices, and not because the name wasn't around before per se, right? So consider it, because it's not obvious at all that even our identities would become the ones we are just calling by name, and that even makes a major impact, because who are you exactly? Are you a Frank? Are you a Teutonic? Are you an Italic? Right? They are loaded in lots of semantic meaning there. There were some lands that, as you know, were called already still in different ways. There was, say, Gothia, for example, in southwestern Frankish kingdom. There was Romania around Ravenna. That was the land of the Romans. And today we have a country that is Romania, by the way. And that, of course, well, that's another story, how it came to be. But just to make you understand that some names, how easily names can change. Think about the Anglo-Saxons. Where did the Saxons go? Where did the poor youths go? By the way, nobody mentions. It's funny, but I mean, probably they would have been pretty upset if they had known what happened in the meanwhile, and legitimately so. What is interesting in Germany specifically is that by the end of the 10th century, already that sense of Frankishness had been lost, per se. Why is this? Well, because Germany, as we've seen, had various ethnic duchies, and they had to find a common name that eventually emerged from this synecdoche that still had in the common language some connection, because there was a broader ancestral mythological meaning of the etymology of Deutsch, the Teutschen, that was connected with the Teutonics of Marius and of the Cimbri, etc. So this eventually was resumed because, of course, an important part was played by the fact that the ruling dynasty was Saxon, and that even receiving important support from Franconia, this wasn't, and that would become actually the seat of the following Franconian Salian dynasty, that was also, however, descending from the Saxons itself, like not quite the center, but there was, because this is the point, there wasn't a center in Germany. The first Carolingian capital had been Regensburg, because it was on the Danube, close to the eastern marches. It was easier to deal with things with there, but even the concept of capital, especially in Central Europe, is pretty vague thing. I mean, not even Vienna until the early modern age was properly conceived as a capital of a country. A different is, for example, London and Paris, and even you shouldn't be surprised of the fact that even it's London that is the earliest and more proper capital since Anglo-Saxon times. Probably in Europe at this point, at least of what would become the modern states, for what you could still see you could already see appearing from that point. It was an early chancery in London. There were lots of already administrative activities connected with properly royal administration. Rex Anglorum, in this same period, becomes the usual title of kings who extended their power northwards from Wessex. So again, it's this beautiful, aggressive imperial ideology that the Anglo-Saxons probably have in their blood, and it speaks of much of their success. The Anglo-Saxon so-called Eptarchy is fascinating because, again, this power emerged from quite a unique political and social system. It's not the same as, say, Scandinavia. It's not the same as the continent. And it's actually very advanced, after all. It's somehow similar to what was the Longobards system before the Franks came in. It had a very few, in fact, analogies with others. So there is properly also an Englishness defining itself through that specific administration. Things would be screwed up a little bit, telling the truth, by the Danish influence and even more by the Norman one, but the latter at least resumed still an important degree of the previous administrative practice, and still it was an ethnic minority, so many English Anglo-Saxon practices, as you know, survived later on, and just the Normans were pretty well aware, as we were saying before, of the advantages of finally ruling over a country that was not that terrifying feudal forest like France was in that 1066. What about Poland? About the Magyars, first of all, you know that, right? In Hungary there is a few to assess, like but we will talk about it later. But first, Poland. Poland had been inhabited by 8 distinct groupings. There is also a dramatic proximity with Bohemia, for example. So you can't even quite say where Poland emerged from, if not from this area. In fact, essentially lesser Poland, greater Poland. And that, in fact, manages to, even there, in a brutally imperial sense, there is probably even a steppe flavor, even though these were sedentary peoples. But never underestimate the Iranian lordship mentality that would remain in the heart and soul of the Polish Szlachta. Sort of, in fact, single Polish potestas. That is the one of Mieszko the first, of course. And that eventually is coalesced, in fact, gestated and developed further by the relations between the Poles and the Ottonians that were cooperative, aside from some periodical bloodshed in the frontiers. And this progress must be appreciated because there wasn't much of at least Germany in part had been colonized by the Franks and previously by the Romans. So a good half of the country was somehow already with some important infrastructure, stability, some caters, and so on. The Slavic lands were brutally tribal. There was these hill forts essentially dominating, if you want, just a modest area. But the Piasts that emerged now, just like the Przemyslids, etc., made a video about the creation of the Przemyslid Duchy. That is in the same 10th century, but today we just talk about kingdoms. Managed to, even there with with a sword fundamentally, and there was not much of another way, and with extreme complicacies that we have highlighted in that video about medieval Poland between also the 10th and 12th century, to establish this country, to establish this identity, to affirm a generic Polish, which is a national name. It's not a dynastic name. It's not a and it hadn't existed like a previous circumscription, etc. So that's why it's remarkable per se, and that manages to form today, even one of the largest countries in Europe, in spite of the enormous terrifying things that happen there, and that's where you realize that there is an ancient root to things that cannot quite be simply dislodged, and that there is a will of power development and civilizational development that goes on because people want it to. So naturally there is a lot of ethnic invention in the process, because as we were saying before, we reason treat ethnicities at in a contemporary national scale. At the time it was a completely different horizon. There were even national identities emerging from political disasters rather than accomplishments, for that matter. But the association with kingship, and so with rule, right, is always the base for regnal identity that eventually can even be detached from any particular dynasty, and thus coming to define a country as a whole, where dynastic change can happen and still the country remain the same. I mean, look at the Kingdom of England, right, from Anglo-Saxon to Anglo-Danish to Anglo-Norman times. Yeah, we were talking about the Magyars, but they're actually not a kingdom. At least they will not become until the 11th century, so we will not describe it. But you understand that also many traits of that Magyar activity survived in the Hungarian kingdom. We described the huge problems posed by the oligarchs, always that were very well entrenched in this ethnic Magyar core that was in part even populated in a semi-nomadic way up to very late in time, and so creating problem to the monarchy on the longer run, and still, however, having made an Hungarian nationality, identity, etc., surviving still today, even as a distinct language in a sea of Slavs, essentially, and that's also to appreciate, given it was founded even in a much more kind of at least non-sedentary sense, so even with different bases, in fact, from essentially all these powers we have seen now. We will talk a lot, as you understand, again about 10th century history, because it's huge, as underappreciated, especially as far as these polities emerging after the collapse of the Carolingian Empire is concerned, but also these other surrounding ones that somehow made it, also in response to aggression and in lands that were worse, let's say, they were disadvantaged, let's put it in this way, compared to the ones of their threateners, right? So you see there that the effort was made, and with pretty solid consequences. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.